The story of ECW on TNN is one that a lot of fans know the gist of. The two sides had a year-long relationship which went downhill pretty quickly and ended very bitterly, with ECW not far from going out of business, and the channel ready to welcome WWE. Did you know, however, that it didn't exactly start in the best way either? When I began to look into the timeline, starting with the beginnings of TNN expressing interest in airing wrestling, I discovered that the road to episode 1 was far bumpier than I ever knew. That's what this video is gonna be about. In this video, we'll look at the state of ECW in mid-1999. We'll look at the timeline of disasters that happened before the promotion even went on the air. Then finally, we'll look at TNN episode 1 to see what hit TV screens in the end. While the official announcement of the TNN show would happen at the end of June, it's important to understand the state of ECW at the time. In April, the Wrestling Observer would claim that even 2 years before the end, checks were bouncing and talent wasn't getting paid. There have been several bounced checks again over the past 2 weeks, starting a lot of rumours about the company being one step from the grave. Paul Heyman again met with the wrestlers on April 17th and said that everything would be okay financially in another month. Since he said that before, the confidence in those statements is pretty low. There were, however, deals on the table that looked like they could help ECW stay afloat. For example, Paul Heyman was attempting to strike a deal with Acclaim Entertainment to license ECW video games. This deal was very important for the company, as Wade Keller notes in the Pro Wrestling Torch, as it could potentially make ECW solvent and debt-free for the first time in well over a year. The alternative for Paul was by far a less desirable option. Without the deal, there were rumours of the WWF or WCW being interested in bailing out ECW in return for part or whole ownership. In June, Paul would eventually land the video game deal, and Hardcore Revolution would be released in February 2000. This alone wasn't going to rid Heyman of his financial woes, but larger national exposure on television might. A week later, Wade would add that Acclaim would likely strike a video game deal with whoever ends up with the Nashville network deal. If that's the case, ECW's future strongly hinges on getting a clearance from TNN. As Wade is alluding to here, TNN was looking to add wrestling to its schedule, and had a few different options on the table. While ECW was struggling to make deals to keep themselves going, the channel formerly known as the Nashville Network were looking to rebrand themselves. In the April 19th Observer, before ECW was in talks with them, it was reported that there was a lot of talk about TNN carrying pro wrestling, starting in August on Friday nights in primetime, either in the current Roller Jam time slot or as part of a 2-hour block. While Dave speculates that this could lead to a new promotion starting up, he says that TNN had talked with both ECW and NWA about the slot. ECW had a meeting scheduled for earlier this week with TNN, so the fact there was a meeting says they must still be in contention. Another candidate in the running was Howard Lipkin's group out of Las Vegas, which could well have become the very short-lived WXO, which would end up only running one television taping before going out of business. It's here in the timeline that we get to the first major problem that ECW faced on the way to landing the TNN deal. One of their biggest stars leaving on fiercely bad terms. On May 16th, 1999, ECW presented its Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view from Poughkeepsie, New York. While the show's best remembered for a battle between Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn, who had stolen the show at the last pay-per-view too, what was going on behind the scenes was far more interesting. Representatives from several television channels were backstage watching the show, including TNN, Showtime and MTV. As ECW had been in talks with all of them, all of these were important people backstage. Paul Heyman needed to book a show putting ECW's best foot forward, but it wouldn't happen without some drama. Just one day before the pay-per-view, one of Paul's top stars would appear on an indie show at the ECW arena called Breaking the Barrier, which I talked about in more detail in my video about the historic venue. At this event, Shane Douglas would cut a scathing promo against ECW in the ring, quitting the company in the process. Shane's issues with Paul had been growing for a while. He reportedly didn't attend the previous weekend's event in Philadelphia because he was told that he wasn't welcome after previously being booked. Paul Heyman told The Torch, "I had a conversation with Shane Douglas at the beginning of last week, at which point I told him it's better for the locker room and better for he and I not to be in the same locker room, and that the time had come for us to go our separate ways." Heyman then went further, claiming that Douglas had threatened to expose the real financial status of ECW to TNN to try and kill the deal. Of all the people who Paul Heyman has had a public falling out with over the years, Shane Douglas is one of the few that doesn't seem to have made up with him, so there might have been some truth to this reporting. Upon finding out about Shane quitting, Paul knew he had to do something to save face with the TV reps. He would call in a huge star who had worked sporadic dates for the company, someone who he knew would look impressive to the network reps. Paul would, at 11:30 the night before the pay-per-view, call Sid Vicious, who luckily made it to the event in time. This ended up from a TV rep standpoint being a genius move by Paul, as he was able to show that Douglas's loss on the show wouldn't be missed, and that he was replacing him with a bigger star that the fans would pop big for when he showed up, which is what happened. However, from a booking standpoint, it would end up being bittersweet. Paul's plan was for Sid to receive the biggest ovation from the crowd possible, hopefully impressing the reps. He did this though, by sacrificing two of his up-and-coming top heels, Just Incredible and Lance Storm. I talked about this in more detail in my video about Sid and ECW, but in short, the segment would be just a bit of a mess. Justin, who had been supposed to face Shane Douglas, would be interrupted in the ring by Sid and his manager, Judge Jeff Jones. It would take Justin's cane, which seemingly had no effect, Lance Storm, Jason Knight, and a run-in by Sabu to finally beat down Sid, who would pop up from it all like a movie monster, only to attack Jeff Jones afterwards. In itself, the segment makes the best out of a bad situation brought about by Shane quitting, but Justin and Lance came out of it looking a bit ineffectual against Sid, who wasn't going to be staying. Sid would only make one more appearance in ECW, teasing an ongoing story with Justin and Sabu, but this would never come to anything. Justin in particular had been quite protected up to this point. He was a project of Paul's. He'd beaten many an ECW great, and was likely set to beat Douglas as well, but the booking on this night didn't exactly make him look strong. Despite all the chaos at Hardcore Heaven, Paul must have done something right. The June 7th Observer reports that ECW was basically all but confirmed officially to be coming to TNN later in the year. Dave does say though that the contracts have yet to be signed and all the terms haven't been exactly worked out. On June 30th, after nearly a month of questioning, the official announcement would be made. In the coverage, we learn the reason for the 8 PM time slot. ECW has been slotted in the early evenings because it's considered the best bet to draw a strong lead-in audience for TNN's Roller Jam and Championship Rodeo and Motor Madness shows that follow. When asked about this, Paul Heyman wasn't perturbed in any way by the time slot not exactly being what he was used to. We bring to the table something that they need, which is a strong lead-in for Roller Jam. We already have the core audience, and hopefully we can expand that audience, but it's a proven product on late night television. That's something that they need. ECW didn't exactly have a ton of leverage in negotiations, since they're an unproven product on a national scale that has gone through a year of financial problems. Paul Heyman, as you can imagine, phrases it differently, telling The Torch, "I think it's an incredibly intelligent deal on behalf of a network that understands what their exposure is bringing to this company. And they have every right to ask for that, because they're the ones that are going to put us on the map. It certainly gives us a chance to entice more people to buy our tapes, or shirts, or dolls, or whatever we're selling, including our tickets and our pay-per-views. Paul's mentality, and I suppose this had to be the way he looked at it, was that if TNN helped ECW grow, then TNN were going to take a cut from that. Therefore, it's in the network's best interest to work with him, and then all could reap the rewards. This line from Wade, though, pulls back the curtain a bit on what TNN's approach might have been, and how different it was to Paul's. TNN privately is touting the deal as a no-lose situation for them. They get a huge percentage of all ECW revenue above what current levels in every category, from pay-per-view and arena shows to merchandising and websites. TNN also reserves the right to buy 10% of ECW after 1 year. Paul Heyman would waste no time telling his audience about the big news, and he would do it on the air. On July 3rd, at the Elks Lodge in Queens, New York, Paul Heyman would stand in the ring and tell the fans that on August 13th, ECW would start on TNN. Remember this date because it'll become more important soon. Joey Styles would then confirm that this 13th date is a special episode, with the main series beginning on August 27th at 8 PM. Paul's announcement would air for television viewers on July 17th, one night before ECW's next pay-per-view and Paul Heyman's next big headache. Unlike the previous year's Heatwave, which is regarded among the fans to be one of the best ECW events ever, the 99 version is largely remembered mainly for an unscripted part of the show, and it involved Bubba Ray Dudley. There had been several nights where Bubba had stirred up the fans so much that they wanted to get into the ring and fight him. This one from Elks Lodge in Queens is my personal favourite, with a fan going over the balcony to try and get to Bubba. At Heatwave, his promo was so antagonistic towards the fans, picking out individuals and being quite vulgar with his jokes, that there were claims that he nearly incited a riot in the building. According to the Torch's coverage of the event, Bubba, it seems, would catch a lot of heat for this, essentially being punished for his verbiage. Sources say Heyman was hoping Bubba would become a locker room leader heading into the TNN show. Instead, Bubba has earned himself a place in the doghouse of Heyman and the wrestlers in general. But given that riling the crowd up was a normal part of the Dudleys act, why did it get Bubba in so much hot water this time? What you might not have heard before is that TNN reps were again in the building as they were at Hardcore Heaven, and they were none too impressed with Bubba's promo, nor the overly violent match that followed, where Spike Dudley and Balls Mahoney would win back the tag team titles against Bubba Ray and Devon. This match and the pre-match turned out to be controversial, as there were folks in the cable industry, in particular at Viewer's Choice and also at TNN, who were upset about the pre-match mic work by Bubba, both the level of the swearing and inciting the crowd, feeling he was inciting a riot. And the match, in particular the close-ups of the blood and the flaming tables. This wasn't helped by the idea that some thought that Bubba knew exactly what he was doing. Many believe Bubba knew his comments were crossing the line, especially the racial comment, but claim Bubba is starting to believe his own hype and is too concerned with his gimmick of being the greatest tag team in history. That last part's pretty funny if you've heard Bubba continuing to make this claim in 2025. As far as the violence of the match goes, the network rep's reaction to this actually influenced the rest of the show. Later in the night, Taz would defeat Yoshihiro Tajiri, retaining his ECW World title, in a match with a quite unique finish. Taz would be awarded the win by submission, as he choked Tajiri with barbed wire, during which the camera angle shown was from the very top end of the building, meaning that TV viewers could barely tell what was going on. This was apparently done as a direct reaction to the TV reps being unhappy with the violence shown in the Dudleys match, something I'd always wondered about. It does make you want to ask the question though, did TNN properly know what they were getting? And was there perhaps any buyer's remorse a month before the premiere air date? As ECW got closer to the debut date, it seemed like they just couldn't stay out of trouble. In fact, they were finding impressive new ways of getting in more trouble. In the July 26th Observer, it's noted that Joel Gertner will work with Joey Styles as the announcing team for the TNN shows. It's something of a debatable decision. It would become even more of a debatable decision a few days later, after Joel would cross the line on that week's Hardcore TV. But first, some context. On July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. would pilot a plane that crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, not far from Martha's Vineyard Airport in Massachusetts. You may be wondering, what could this possibly have anything to do with ECW for? On the July 24th, 99 episode of Hardcore TV, Joel Gertner would go on a lengthy and ill-advised rant about the recent death of JFK Jr. Joel's rant was clearly meant to be about how much of the news coverage was spent on the story and seemingly not much else. But it being Joel Gertner, it was laced with distasteful jokes. As you can probably imagine, this didn't sit well with the media. TV Guide published a critical article, and the MSG network went as far as to not even air the segment, instead replacing it with commercials. Paul Heyman, on the other hand, was quoted to be happy with the attention it got them. Explaining the piece, Heyman told The Torch, "We were looking for controversy more or less without using violence or swearing," and said that he helped Gertner write the piece, which he claims was inspired by a Dennis Leary comedy routine. Despite Paul being happy with the attention the segment received, this and the incident at Heatwave weren't a good look approaching the new show on TNN, which TV Guide had described in their article as TV's traditionally wholesome Nashville network. But Paul was ready to welcome any publicity as good publicity at the time. We jump ahead now to August 13th, when TNN was supposed to air a History of ECW special, catching new fans up to what the company is all about, while the prospective August 20th one was going to introduce the current roster and storylines. TNN will not be airing the History of ECW show, which was initially talked about for the 2 Fridays before its regular Friday night debut on August 27th. The network was open to the idea of airing the show, but Paul Heyman says he turned them down because they ran out of time to properly promote it. As I noted earlier, the show was first mentioned on television on July 3rd, yet somehow there wasn't enough time to promote it. I could more believe Paul's next reason. All of the newspaper and magazine articles about ECW on TNN have listed August 27th as the debut date. Heyman didn't want to end up debuting on the network with a low rating, and will instead wait for the heavily hyped August 27th series debut. There is, though, an alternative, maybe more accurate depending on who you believe, suggestion posed in The Observer, which claims that the shows didn't materialise due to no show being provided by the deadline. Not the best start, but it's not going to get any better. On the August 14th episode of Hardcore TV, Joey Styles makes some pretty interesting comments about the company's new business partner. Again, before the first episode has even aired, and right after they've already missed their first deadline. Partway through the episode, Joey directly addresses the New York fans watching on the MSG network, relating to the TNN taping set to take place in Queens on August 26th. He stresses that this is not just a national television taping, but now with the new coverage in Canada, this is an international one. The concerning comments would come next, and I'm gonna quote him here. "If I may, I'm gonna shoot for you fans. TNN didn't want us to tape their TV show at the Elks Lodge, the madhouse of extreme. They said it's not a TV-worthy building. We want a 5,000 seat building where we can hang a lighting grid and have a big ramp. No, ECW fought to have a TNN taping at the madhouse of extreme, the Elks Lodge." He ends by saying, "We will see you there whether they like it or not. And they will like it because the ratings will prove it." Admittedly, it's fair to point out that this was a localized ad that was just going out to their New York fans, and it was said with the rebellious tone and attitude that ECW was known for. But it's still a pretty daft move to say to your most loyal fans, that new network we just joined, they don't want you. Especially, again, before episode 1 has even aired. On the same day, August 14th, ECW held what was supposed to be the tapings for the launch episode in Toledo, Ohio. The card had been stacked with a Dream Partners tag team match pitting Rob Van Dam and Just Incredible against Jerry Lynn and Sabu. I promise you I said that right, because those pairings make no sense. A big tag team championship change had been planned too. Actually, a few big changes had been planned. There was consideration given to booking 2 singles title changes at the initial TNN tapings. Jerry Lynn to defeat Rob Van Dam in the first hour to capture the TV title, then Van Dam beating Taz to capture the ECW heavyweight title during the second hour. Taz signing a contract last week probably led to the change in plans. Taz had quite openly been in talks with WWE at the time, and while it wouldn't be long until he did leave, he had told Paul he would be staying, leading to these plans changing. While some of the taping would be used for episodes of Hardcore TV, like Spike and Balls defeating the Dudleys for the tag titles, much of the night's taping was deemed unairable and wasn't seen on TNN. Sources say Heyman was visibly disappointed after the show. He didn't consider the event a disaster and cited the strong crowd reaction as a positive, but said the show just didn't come off as well as he'd expected. After viewing the footage, Heyman is said to have lightened up and admitted to friends he may have set his expectations too high. For the sake of fairness, it should also be noted that although Heyman didn't like the Toledo ECW TNN tapings, TNN officials who were on hand were apparently thrilled at the initial taping. After the main event, the representatives reportedly hugged several members of the ECW crew and voiced their approval. They also took time to meet some of the wrestlers before and after the show. It's never made clear exactly what Heyman wasn't happy about, not specifically at least, with the Torch saying that he was disappointed in the way some of the booking plans came across. If I were being a conspiracy theorist, given the comments that Joey Styles made earlier, I wouldn't be shocked if Paul wanted the first TNN tape matches to come from the Elks Lodge taping, but we'll never really know. In one last note before the first episode aired, Wade Keller claimed that sources within the cable industry are saying TNN expects a 3.0 rating from ECW from the start. TNN launched a cross-channel advertising campaign last Friday to hype the series' debut. To put this number into a bit of perspective, the previous episode of Raw had drawn a 6.6 rating, and Nitro the same night a 3.3. It would be a tough ask for ECW to match Nitro on its very first week, especially since a few weeks earlier, Wade had printed that TNN is a low-rated cable network, but they do draw peak ratings around 2.0 for big NASCAR broadcasts. This finally brings us to episode 1 of ECW on TNN, which would air on August 27th, 1999. For all the pitfalls and unfortunate events that had taken place on the way to this night, ECW would take full advantage of its first hour, doing their very best to set themselves apart from the other promotions. The first thing we see is a cold open of the Dudleys putting Balls Mahoney through a table that's on fire. Over the top of it, Joey Styles confidently tells us, "This isn't the WWF, this isn't WCW, this is ECW on TNN." ECW would air essentially what the preview specials would have been, the only unique content being Joey Styles' links between segments. They started by showing the entirety of the Rob Van Dam vs Jerry Lynn TV title match from Hardcore Heaven. While this match was undoubtedly an ECW classic, and helpful because it filled almost half of the hour, it wasn't exactly the original content that TNN had wanted, but at least it was a very popular match, and one that was going to draw in any new fan. There are far worse ways to make a first impression. Next, ECW would make an absolutely genius move. Instead of showing their former world champions or current stars, which they would do later, Joey introduced a list of big names who used to work for ECW, making the point that all of them failed to capture the ECW world title, despite becoming massively successful elsewhere. Names like Conan, Cactus Jack, and even Stone Cold Steve Austin. If a brand new fan were tuning in and saw that Steve Austin had tried and failed to win the ECW belt, it might well leave them asking, how good must the ECW locker room be? They would follow this up with another very clever move, by introducing some of the former ECW World Champions, with two of the most notable being Raven and the Sandman. The reason this is so clever is that both of them had been recently working for WCW, and both were on their way back, set to appear on TNN very soon. Raven had, in fact, returned to ECW just 24 hours before this episode aired, at the Queen's TV taping, interfering in the main event for the tag team titles, preventing the Dudley Boys, who were on their last night in ECW, taking the tag team titles to WWE with them, by winning them with his fierce rival Tommy Dreamer. Sandman wouldn't be back in ECW for a few more weeks, making his triumphant surprise return at the ECW Arena on October 23rd, 1999. It was then a very smart move for ECW to highlight these two, given that they would be a major part of the show very soon. It served as a preview of sorts, but the fans didn't know that yet. Up next we get our second match of the night, a world title bout that originally aired on the June 26, 1999 Hardcore TV, where Taz would face the rookie monster of Steve Corino, that rookie monster being Rhino. Taz would beat Rhino handily in just a couple of minutes, and knowing the absolute killer that Rhino would become over the next year, it's crazy to see him as essentially enhancement talent in this match with Taz, his first ever on ECW TV. One more quite interesting thing that ECW aired was a very brief match, just seconds long in fact, but it really got across the rowdy nature of the Queens New York fans. Spike Dudley versus Big Sal, who they would name on the lower third as the 600-pound Sal Graziano versus Little Spike the Giant Killer. As it turns out, this match was actually taped an entire year earlier. It aired originally on the August 29th, 1998 episode of Hardcore TV, and was probably chosen because it came from the Elks Lodge, where the following week's episodes had been taped from. Spike would hit a low blow and an acid drop for the win in about 30 seconds. As I mentioned in my quick recap of Sal's career in a recent video, Sal lost to Spike many times, often to get the crowd cheering, but also to get across Spike's giant killer persona. The rest of the hour would be spent briefly introducing the rest of the ECW roster, with a particular focus on Lance Storm and Just Incredible, who are among the few who get promo time. We see cleverly edited clips of them beating down well-known names, like the Dudleys and Shane Douglas. I say cleverly because they at one point show Justin and Lance beating up Sid Vicious from Hardcore Heaven, but not the parts where Sid beat them up. Following a Kid Rock music video showing off the rest of the roster, the show ends with a promo from the world champion Taz. We see footage of him choking out who else but Shane Douglas to win that title, because Paul has never shied away from being spiteful from time to time. Taz promises that he will continue to tap out all challengers, and he would for a little bit longer. After all the talk before the show aired of a 3.0 rating, how would episode 1 actually do? The first broadcast of ECW drew a 0.9 rating, the highest rated show on TNN that night. Most importantly, they would do much better than Roller Jam, which only earned a 0.6. If you've never watched a video on this channel before, I promise I don't normally talk about ratings, but this time it's quite significant. The next week, Wade Keller would give more of an explanation about the high estimate. The second ECW program on TNN grew to a 1.0 rating, which is in line with what TNN executives hoped and expected the show would draw in its first few weeks. TNN officials guaranteed advertisers a 2.0 average rating for the first season, but it is standard practice in the advertising industry to oversell ratings rather than undersell them. Over the next few months, the show's ratings would show slow growth, just as Paul Heyman had predicted, regularly passing 1.0, at least until late in the run, when things really started going south between both sides. The highest rating that the show would ever draw on a few different occasions was a 1.1. Now, I've been quite critical of ECW in this video, sometimes maybe deservedly, but one thing I will say is that watching that first episode of TNN and all the clever ways they put their best foot forward really helped me forget all the hurdles they tripped over just to get there. It had a bit of everything that there was to love about watching ECW. Hard-hitting wrestling, savage promos, a bit of comedy, and some shameless self-promotion. And of course, that attitude. The attitude that some say others took from. Others who might have ended up on TNN too. It's been said many times that Paul Heyman was an excellent wrestling booker, and that his greatest skill was being able to accentuate the positives of a talent and hide away their weaknesses. You can do this in a lot of areas of life, like PR and promotion, but unfortunately, you can't just hide away the negatives in business. Why the ECW and TNN relationship failed is a conversation that has to look more at the run of the show itself. But I've tried to show in this video that as rough as the road to the debut was, the first episode was booked in a manner that Paul always tried to, by hiding ECW's negatives and leaving you wanting more. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.